Welcome to the webinar. We're going to be discussing the COVID-19 vaccines and how they will affect your business. I'm Kimball Parker, the CEO of SixFifty. Before we begin, I just want to make a few announcements for some of our customers on the call. The first is that California OSHA issued some pretty strict new regulations for employers a few weeks ago. We held a webinar about it last week, and we created an automated tool to help companies generate the policies and other compliance paperwork that they need. If you're interested in the webinar or the automated compliance paperwork, please reach out. You can email sales@sixfifty.com. We are monitoring every turn there. Second, we're working with Wilson Sonsini and Marina Tsatalis, who's on this webinar, to create an automated handbook. COVID has affected nearly every employee policy, and we found that most handbooks are now out of date and potentially dangerous from a liability perspective. We're working hard, and we're planning to release that product in early January. So look out for that. So without further ado, we have two presenters here today that are going to give us a real informative view on COVID-19, the vaccines, and what it will mean for your business. First, we have Dr. William Daines. He's a primary care internist in Salt Lake City and is the medical director of the clinical operations for Castell, which is Intermountain's population health platform company. Prior to joining Castell in 2019, Dr. Daines held a variety of leadership positions at Intermountain Healthcare related to telehealth, value-based care, and clinical operations. Dr. Daines received his medical degree from the Weill Cornell Medical College in New York City. He completed an internship at the University of Utah and a residency in internal medicine at Stanford University. Following his residency, Dr. Daines worked as a hospitalist at Stanford University and held academic appointments at Stanford University. He was a hospitalist at Stanford Hospital. Apologies. And held academic appointments at Stanford University. In addition to his administrative responsibilities, Dr. Daines maintains an active primary care practice. I came across Dr. Daines because my wife works at Intermountain Healthcare and has been receiving briefings on COVID and the vaccines from Dr. Daines. And so we asked Dr. Daines to come on with us today and to give us some information about the vaccine. Our second guest here today is Marina Tsatalis. We work very closely with Marina to automate our employment legal tools. Marina is one of the leaders of the employment group with Wilson Sonsini. She represents leading technology communications, pharmaceutical, and life sciences companies, including Google, Mylan, Expedia, Salesforce, etc. And I think it's not hyperbole to say that she's one of the most important employment experts in the nation, and dare I say, the world. Okay, so with that, we're going to hold questions till the end. And so Dr. Daines is going to present first, and then we're going to have Marina present second. Again, Dr. Daines will cover the medical information. Marina will cover the legal information. Let me give you one disclaimer, which is that nothing in this webinar should be construed as medical or legal advice. This is just medical and legal information. And so before acting upon any of this information, you should consult a doctor or an attorney. So with that, Dr. Daines, why don't you take over here? Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you, Kimball. Can you hear me?
We can hear you perfectly. Thank you.
Great. And are you seeing a PowerPoint presentation?
We are indeed.
Great. Well, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to join you to talk about COVID-19 vaccines and some really promising, exciting news that's come across recently. This is just a typical disclaimer slide. Thank you, Kimball, for introducing that concept. Specifically, I would say that nothing I say should be understood as a product endorsement or a guarantee of a timeline or anything of that nature. So I'm going to spend a few minutes talking to you about vaccines, the concept, and specifically how it relates to COVID, and then importantly, what it means for us as a society and us as individuals going forward. I am going to go kind of quickly because there is so much news happening right now. I want to give you a sense of the breadth and the meaning of what we're seeing in this really exciting time. So I'll start with just a general question. What is a vaccine? It is a simple idea that has a profound impact on health. The idea here is to create immunity to an illness before the illness, before exposure to a pathogen, so the body can fight off an infection or minimize the severity of an infection. And that concept of minimizing the severity of an infection will come into play a bit later as we talk about what to make of the COVID vaccine news. So the typical course of how the body experiences an infection is that you're exposed to a pathogen, you develop an infection, meaning some sort of clinical aberration from your normal state of being. That could be redness of the skin, it could be pneumonia in the lungs. The body senses an invader and creates an immune response. Hopefully that immune response is timely enough and robust enough that you recover from that infection. If the immune system cannot create a response to that infection that is meaningful, you can go on to death. But if you do recover, you have some retained immunity. The body has learned of that pathogen, has developed a response, and holds that in store for any future exposures. The idea of a vaccine is that you pre-expose your body to some element of that pathogen, enough that you can create an immune response without actually going through the infection, such that when you are eventually exposed, you don't develop that infection. You're ready to fight it off from day one, not the normal week or two that it takes the body to develop immunity to a new pathogen, and that you would actually retain that immunity through your life. So vaccines have a long and interesting history. I know it's a lot of non-medical people on this call, so I decided not to use a lot of gross out medical images. So here are some drawings. The formal history of vaccines goes back to the mid-18th century. Dr. Edward Jenner was the first physician to formally propose an idea of vaccination and act on it. He observed that milkmaids, so women who milked cows, somehow had a degree of protection against smallpox. Smallpox or variola was a tremendously dangerous disease that would ravage communities. But he saw that these milkmaids had some form of immunity. When it passed through a community, they did not suffer. Milkmaids were known to develop something called cowpox. That is the image over here on the bottom right. It was an infection that looked in some ways similar to smallpox, but was not deadly for humans. These milkmaids would be exposed to that through the course of their normal work, and that seemed to create immunity. He took this idea and said, what if we took a little bit of pus from the hand of a woman actively experiencing a cowpox outbreak and gave that to somebody who had not yet been exposed to smallpox? And he found that you actually, by virtue of transferring some substance from a cowpox sufferer to a healthy person, you then were protected against smallpox when smallpox came to the community. Here's a little bit of trivia for you all when you go back to barroom trivia nights. The word vaccination actually comes from the Latin word for cow or vacca, because it was cowpox that actually conveyed that protection. So while that formal history begins with Dr. Jenner, the idea of some form of inoculation or variolation, coming from the word variola, meaning smallpox, had been practiced broadly in a number of civilizations for many, many centuries. The idea was that you would transfer pus from the wound of somebody who has smallpox to a healthy individual, and that person would therefore have immunity. There's an interesting story of a slave in colonial America, a slave of Cotton Mather, the Puritan preacher, who brought with him from his homeland in Africa this practice of inoculation. he was disbelieved when he said to people in his community that he could help protect them from smallpox. He did get a small following, and when smallpox came through Boston in 1721, 14% of the total community passed away from smallpox. Those that did not believe this slave Onesimus died at a rate of 1 in 7. Those who did believe him and were inoculated by a physician died at a rate of 1 in 40. So a much better survival rate, and it introduces a number of pandemic themes. We fear and we distrust new things. We have a hard time believing, as we did with masks, that things that are well known in other cultures could transfer to our culture. And we learned that group distrust of science can have major public health complications. So before we can talk about what vaccines, or what the specific COVID vaccine world looks like, I want to just talk about a few immunology and vaccine basics. So what is a virus? A virus is a machine that replicates its own genetic material. It can't actually replicate it itself. It has to hijack a host to replicate that genetic material. So here, coronavirus is attaching to a human cell by virtue of something called a spike protein. It attaches to a receptor on the cell called the ACE2 receptor. It's taken into that cell, it releases its genetic material, and then it hijacks the normal genetic material replication process in the cell to create more of itself, which is then released. A virus doesn't care about making people sick or not. It doesn't care about anything. It cares about replicating its own genetic material. In terms of how the body creates an immune response to the virus, it sees the virus coming in, something called an antigen presenting cell, which is a type of white blood cell or type of immune cell, ingests that virus, breaks it up into pieces, and then presents certain of those pieces on the surface of the antigen presenting cell so that other cells in the immune system can identify those little fragments of the pathogen and then start two separate processes. One is it creates an antibody response where these little proteins, these Y-shaped proteins called antibodies, can go and attack other virus that it sees circulating. It also prompts something called a cytotoxic T cell to then go and destroy cells already infected. But this idea of little bits of a virus being presented to the immune system so you can create a response is really important. And that's what we're essentially taking advantage of when we talk about developing a vaccine. But you're really threading a biological needle here. You need to activate the immune system. You need to get the right chemical, the right antigen presented. You need to get it into your system, visible to those antigen presenting cells, but you also need to do it in such a way that you don't create illness. You can't just present the whole virus or else you would induce an infection. You need to present the right one so that your body is creating an antibody response against the virus. So there are lots of different vaccine platforms or technologies that are used. There are essentially different ways of getting that material into the system and taking advantage of that immune response to preemptively create an immune response. Most of the vaccines that we all have gotten throughout our lives are what are called viral vectors, where you put some of the material from the pathogen you're trying to create immunity against onto or into some other viral form. Adenovirus is a common one, other relatively inert viruses, where you're taking advantage of that virus's capability of getting into the system to basically do stowaway of that genetic material into the body. There are also some instances in which you will take the actual virus and weaken it or inactivate it in some way. Really what we're going to talk about today is a new form of vaccine, a new platform or new technology, this concept of nucleic acids or genetic vaccines, mRNA and DNA vaccines. There are also some protein-based technologies that are in development. It's really important to say that the vast majority of vaccines we have are in this first category, and there actually have not previously been any approved vaccines in these two novel categories. And yet, when you look at the New York Times and other registers of the top candidate vaccines, many of them, like the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines, are from this new technology platform. And this has really vast implications in terms of where we can take vaccines in the next 5 to 10 years. There are also adenovirus vectors, some protein vectors, and some inactivated coronavirus vector vaccines that are in development. In terms of threading that needle, we also have to be sure that vaccines are safe. Many of you have probably heard phrasing around phase 1, phase 2, phase 3. This is really a pathway of developing vaccines such that you ensure both effectiveness and safety. And the typical timeline for vaccine development is usually 5 to 10 years. So what I'm going to describe in terms of coronavirus vaccine is truly a breakthrough of science. In terms of what a nucleic acid or a genetic vaccine is doing, is taking a little fragment of the coronavirus spike gene, that key that unlocks the door into the cell, and trying to get it into the body so that you can then create the protein and then have that go out and be detected by the immune system. RNA, it's a form of genetic material. It's a single-stranded molecule that is used in normal cell processing as we go from DNA to creating a protein. Here it's just conveying material into the body that then creates these proteins that then are sensed by the immune system. So where are we right now in terms of vaccine candidates? And before I go into details, I really just want to put things in perspective. We are basically 1 year into this global pandemic. There were a few cases that were detected retroactively in mid-November in Wuhan province, but really it's December 2019 that the world acknowledges there is a pandemic on the doorstep. And a year later, we have 2 vaccines that are approved. One is the Pfizer one I'll talk about. The other is a vaccine called CanSino vaccine. We also have another in the Moderna vaccine that is on the doorstep of at least emergency use authorization. But this is a breathtaking accomplishment. The normal timeline of 5 to 10 years has been thrown out the window. 12 to 18 months from identification of pathogen to development of a vaccine to actually getting it into people is truly amazing. And I just would say, let's remember this the next time we have a public debate about public funding of science. It is truly decades and generations of scientists that have gotten us to the point where we could turn this around so quickly. Lots of things had to go right in order for us to get to where we are right now. Lots of things still have to go right to actually get vaccine into people. Science is truly a collaborative and international endeavor. Science, like a vaccine, thankfully does not respect borders, and we can work with people from all across the globe to make things like this happen. So diving in deep on the 2 vaccines you've probably been reading about in the news, there's a Pfizer vaccine and a Moderna vaccine. They are both mRNA vaccines, so they're both using this same new technology. Amazingly, they are both highly effective. We're looking at 95% effectiveness rates. The FDA had set a threshold of a vaccine for COVID must be at least 50% effective to even consider approval, and we're talking 95%. Flu vaccine on a yearly basis is typically in the 60 to 70% effectiveness range. And it's particularly effective in preventing severe COVID, and this is something we'll come back to in terms of implications. We don't yet know what it means in terms of mild cases or that asymptomatic transmission that we see happening in our communities. In both of these trials, there were about 30 to 40,000 enrolled in these trials. Some of those are in a placebo group, some of those are in a study compound group, but total about 30 to 40,000 in each of the trials. As a frame of reference, Shingrix is the most recent commonly used vaccine. It's a vaccine for shingles. It was approved on the basis of 2 trials. Each of those only had 14,000 patients. So this is a massive recruitment and study effort. The vaccines were thankfully studied in a relatively diverse population in terms of age, gender, ethnicity, and medical comorbidities or medical illnesses. One gap we still have is it has not been studied in those under age 16, and there are 2 trials starting now with these vaccines that will look at them in the younger group. So far, we see very good side effect profiles. There were no serious safety events reported in the initial studies. There are some rather common, but thankfully low-grade side effects: fatigue, headache, aches, fever, that we see. This, by the way, is going to create some complexity about how we manage the mass vaccination effort we have to go through. Fatigue, headache, aches, fevers, what does this sound like? It sounds like an early coronavirus infection. And so we have to do a lot of really important public messaging around the idea that A, the vaccine is not giving you COVID, and yeah, there's a chance you may feel crummy for a couple of days, but it is much better to feel crummy for a couple of days with this vaccine than to eventually develop COVID. In post-marketing, or sorry, in post-study experience, so those people in the UK that we've seen, and now some people in the US who are getting the vaccine, we have seen a couple of cases of people with a history of anaphylaxis, so major allergic response, have a mild to moderate allergic response. This is something we're going to have to keep track of, but it doesn't seem like there's a big concern of anaphylaxis among people who've never had anaphylaxis before. Pfizer had an emergency use authorization granted last week. Some healthcare providers in the US have started to get doses this week. I talked with a couple of my colleagues today who've actually had doses at Intermountain Healthcare in Utah. This vaccine requires deep storage, freeze storage, which is, we'll talk about in a second as it relates to how we transport and dispense the vaccine. This makes it a little bit unusual and something we have to plan for. Pfizer's looking at 50 million doses worldwide, about half of those for the US available this year, and another 1.3 billion doses next year. Interestingly, it received no federal funding for R&D, but there was an advanced purchase arrangement by the US federal government. Moderna is apparently going in front of the FDA today for its emergency use authorization. They were supported by the Operation Warp Speed as it relates to R&D, and there was also an advanced purchase arrangement built. It only needs quote unquote regular freezing. We'll talk about in a second why that's important. A couple of other things that are interesting about these vaccines. What I've shown up here for both Pfizer and Moderna are the cumulative incidence curves for, on the bottom line, those that received the vaccine, and on the top line, the one that's climbing, those that received a placebo. What you see in both of those is those curves separate dramatically. So the vaccine is protective. And why I've put a little red circle on both of these is what's interesting is the curves seem to separate before you get the second dose. So there's at least a signal that one dose may convey some immunity. Why is this important? It's important because the faster we can get this vaccine into people and have it working in them, the better off we're going to be in terms of community transmission right now. And if we can later on prove in studies that one dose is enough, we double the number of people we can vaccinate with our current allotment. Now, I want to be very clear, the studies have not proven that one vaccine is enough, one dose is enough, but at least there's enough of a signal that we could have some hope around that. So which one should you get? Slow down. They are in the same ballpark. It shows that COVID is a vaccine amenable disease. They're both much better than the threshold set by the FDA. We can't say that one is better or worse. We definitely need more research for certain populations. And really, you may not have a choice of which one to get. It's probably going to be driven heavily by state procedures and procurement strategies. Also want to just moderate expectations about what the vaccine means in terms of quote unquote getting back to normal. This should not speed your sense of personally returning to normal. After vaccination, you will still need to follow general public health advice relating to masks, distancing, and hand hygiene. I'm probably going to get my vaccine in the next 4 to 6 weeks. I will continue to wear a mask. I will continue to do social distancing for the foreseeable future. Why is that? It's important to acknowledge what these vaccines were set up to prove and what they were not set up to prove. These trials were set up to prove that the vaccine prevented moderate to severe illness and especially critical illness. They were not set up to prove that they were protective against asymptomatic infection or transmission from person to person. We will know that eventually. It may provide protection against transmissibility, but we just can't bank on that yet. I'll say this 1,000 times, we will get back to normal. Masks are not a forever thing, but we're going to do that collectively, not individually. It's not, I got vaccinated and now it's senior spring. It's when enough of us in the community have been vaccinated, we can then start to reduce these restrictions. There are some major logistical issues in terms of actually getting this into people's arms. We have to produce it at scale. We have to solve for these deep freezing needs. Supply chains are really important. And then there's just the normal vaccination distribution versus a COVID vaccine. Right now in the fridge at my clinic, we've got tons of doses of flu vaccine. It can be kept in a normal refrigerator like you would buy at Home Depot. If we have a batch that goes bad, we don't really panic about it because there's plenty of flu vaccine out there in the community. When you're talking about such a resource-limited vaccine, you need a strategy to make sure that no doses go to waste and that we are getting people back for their second dose. And then there are a lot of ethical concerns. Who should get it first? When should they get it? How should they get it? This concept of essential workers is really challenging. It's a concept most of us had not really thought about, at least I hadn't thought about before COVID. Is an essential worker somebody working checkout at a grocery store? Is it a teacher? Is it a stockbroker on a trading floor? Really compelling arguments to be made from a societal standpoint that all of these people are essential in their own way, but in a resource-limited environment, we have to make choices. Same thing goes for pregnant patients. They were not included in the research studies. We know COVID has risks for pregnancy. So does a vaccine potentially. How we weigh those ethical concerns is going to be really important. There's going to be some degree of tiering. It's already happening in terms of who's getting it first. I laid out here the Utah timeline just because I happen to be paying a lot of attention to Utah. Timelines get fuzzier the farther out you get, and this distribution strategy is principally going to be led by states and public health teams that are already exhausted. A couple of things I have to say every time I talk to an audience about COVID. If your question is, should I get a flu shot? The answer is yes. What if I just have a cold? I would say there's no such thing right now as just saying, oh, I'm fine, it's a cold. I have literally in my extended family 2 separate outbreaks that started with somebody who said, oh, I think I just caught a head cold. It can't be COVID. I'm not going to bother getting tested. How will you know when you can get a vaccine? There's no national answer here. It's talk to your local professionals. Can't I get just 1 dose and be protected? Again, early signal that 1 dose offers some protection, but we can't prove it yet, so don't go with just that strategy. Will I need this every year? We do not know yet. It depends on 2 factors. Number 1 is how well does your immune system remember this immunization from year to year? And number 2, how quickly does this virus mutate? The flu virus mutates rapidly. That's why we have to get a new shot every year, is because it's totally new strains. We just don't know yet with COVID what its mutation rate is going to be. What if I have COVID? Do I need the vaccine? Likely yes. It hasn't been studied, so we don't know the comparative immunity granted by a vaccine versus naturally acquired immunity, but it's probably going to be a yes. And then I'm in a special population. Is this safe for me? pregnant, immunosuppressed, autoimmune disease, breastfeeding? The answer is almost always we don't know. So talk to your doctor about risks and benefits. For example, HIV patients were included in the Pfizer study, but meaning having HIV did not get you excluded from the study, but there were not nearly enough patients for us to draw any conclusions about safety in that subpopulation. What does this mean? What does this news mean? Sorry for the typo. This is really important, and please be my ally on this. If you're thinking, well, I saw something on Facebook, I'd better just share it. Please, how we talk about this vaccine is incredibly important. It is another tool in our toolkit. It does not reduce the importance of other measures. We think it's going to take getting more than 60% of the population immunized to really make a dent. There's going to be disinformation out there. Please don't share it. Please don't confuse correlation with causation with randomness. About 2,000 people a day have heart attacks in the US. Statistically speaking, there is going to be somebody who gets a vaccine and has a heart attack 3 days later. Please don't amplify that message. There are robust systems in place to detect events, validate whether they were in fact vaccine caused. We don't need Facebook or Twitter to fill this function. So where are we now? We are between hope and fear. On the left, our fearful current situation. On the right, our hopeful future. We are at a critical juncture, so let's act accordingly. There's a light at the end of this tunnel, but we're still in the dark. These old statements of we can't do this forever change dramatically when there's hope on the horizon, and we are literally at the most impactful moment of this pandemic. What we do now and for the next 90 to 120 days will directly impact how many people live or die. I show here our worrisome trajectory. Even if we kept at our current level of daily deaths for the next 90 days, we're talking 180,000 new deaths before we really get into a mass immunization timeframe. So please, 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 masking, social distancing, hand washing, it's more important now than ever. And with that, I will turn it over to Marina, and I'll take questions at the end. Thank you.
Hey, thank you, Will. Let me just jump in real quick, just to reiterate one point. People who have taken the vaccine, we don't know yet whether they can still spread the vaccine. That's right. Isn't that correct? So even if you've taken the vaccine, you still need to wear a mask because it's possible that you could still receive it and pass it on. Is that right? Correct.
We don't yet know from research whether this vaccine reduces the ability for somebody to get an asymptomatic infection and then transmit it to others. So that's why we're going to say until we have either proven through studies that this vaccine prevents transmissibility, or we feel like we have reached a herd immunity level by virtue of vaccination. If you got vaccinated, you've still got to do the social distancing, the masking, the hand washing until we can prove that we are in a safety zone. It's not a, I got my shot, rip off the mask, go have a party with 50 friends.
Great. Okay. So, well, thank you for that, Dr. Daines. That was incredibly informative. And you can just imagine all of the employment implications here. And so kind of to talk about the law, where it stands, where maybe it'll go, we're going to hand the time over to Marina Tsatalis. So take it away, Marina.
Thank you, Kimball, and thanks, Dr. Daines. That was incredibly informative. So thank you for that. In these, as we've come closer to a vaccine, I received, and I'm sure other employment lawyers have received a number of questions from their clients as to whether, as employers, they will be able to mandate the vaccine for their employee populations. And we've been waiting and anticipating clear guidance on that issue from the EEOC, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, which has thus far provided updated guidance, throughout the pandemic on various employment law issues that it raised, including, at the outset, whether employers could take employees' temperatures, whether they could screen them using a questionnaire about their symptoms, all of the issues that came up along the way, many of the issues were addressed by the EEOC, and we expected and hoped for the same here. And you sort of look around and say, well, schools can require vaccinations of students, and we know that hospitals require vaccines of their employees. So the question was brewing, can other employers, can private employers require the vaccine of their workforce? And just yesterday, the EEOC issued new guidance on the issue. And they did it as part of their technical assistance information, a technical assistance document on the EEOC's website that the EEOC has updated periodically throughout 2020 in the course of the pandemic to answer questions, as I mentioned, about employers' responses to the coronavirus as they've come up and as they implicate the work site. So the answer is from the EEOC, yes. An employer can require its employees to be vaccinated. Now, there are a number of issues and questions that flow from that, but that is the answer from the EEOC. And actually following the guidance and the technical assistance from the EEOC, I'll go through some of those points because it's straight from the EEOC's mouth as to some of the, the prevalent issues that can be raised. And before we get into that, I know Dr. Daines talked about a lot of the medical reasons, compelling medical reasons why a vaccine is important for everyone to take. There are also business reasons that really support having the vaccine and even making it mandatory. I mean, in addition to the fact that it protects workers, it protects your workforce, and therefore allows for productivity and allows for your operations to continue. A number of employees feel, and this is from surveys and things, that they'll be more comfortable working in a workplace where other employees have been vaccinated. It can also provide a competitive advantage. You can imagine if Uber, for example, said to its customers, all Uber drivers are vaccinated, that customers may feel safer getting into an Uber and sharing that space with the driver. The same could be true of restaurants who may, put a sign out saying, all of our employees, all of our waiters and waitresses and everyone who works in the kitchen, everybody has received the vaccine. It could make diners more comfortable and more apt to visit that restaurant. You could say the same about gyms and coffee shops and all of those places. It also raises an interesting question as to whether you can even require customers to be vaccinated. At least one airline has said, I think it was Qantas, that they would require passengers to be vaccinated. So, these are all issues that flow from an employer's right to vaccinate, and there's certainly some business benefits that flow from it. So in terms of the legal implications of requiring the vaccine, under the Americans with Disabilities Act, an employer that's covered by the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act, is not entitled to require a medical examination or disability-related inquiries of its employees unless the medical examination or the inquiry is shown to be job-related and consistent with business necessity, with business necessity. And the EEOC said in its guidance that the vaccine itself is not a medical examination, and that clears the way for employers to permit it. However, even though the vaccine itself is certainly not a disability-related question and it's not a medical examination, there are pre-screening questions, of course, that would go along with the vaccine, questions that would be asked of a potential recipient of a vaccine to make sure that it's appropriate to give them that vaccine. And the EEOC made clear in its guidance that if the employer administers the vaccine, and you can imagine that many employers, just like they administer the flu shot on premises or they set up a tent, I know our own firm makes provisions for employees to get the flu shot. If an employer makes those arrangements once the vaccine becomes more widely available and mandates the vaccine, they'll also be playing the role of having these sort of pre-vaccine medical questions, these screening questions asked of employees to see if they are eligible and appropriate to have the vaccine. And the EEOC said in its guidance, if the employer does that, it has to show that those pre-screening questions, because they are disability-related questions that they're asking employees, are job-related and consistent with business necessity, which is the standard under the Americans with Disabilities Act. For a disability-related inquiry or a medical examination to be job-related and consistent with business necessity, the employer has to show that the employer has a reasonable belief based on objective evidence that the employee's ability to perform an essential job function will be impaired by a medical condition, or that an employee will pose a direct threat due to a medical condition. And those standards that I just articulated come up again and again in the EEOC's discussion of these issues, and will come up as I discuss some of those points that the EEOC raised. So one of the questions that the EEOC answered in its guidance is, healthcare providers, well, I covered the point about the pre-screening questions just now, but the next question was, can we ask employees to show proof of receipt of a COVID-19 vaccine, or is that a disability-related inquiry? So if an employer can mandate vaccines, can the employer mandate proof that employees have been vaccinated in order to come to work, or is that a medical examination? Is that a disability-related question? And the EEOC said it's neither of those. An employer can, who mandates vaccines, can mandate proof that an employee has in fact had the vaccine as a condition of entry to the workplace. Now, remember that it would have to be just proof of the vaccination. You don't want to have other medical information inadvertently provided to the employer. You're not eliciting information about a disability by simply asking for proof of vaccination, and you're making clear to employees that they should not provide any further information. The EEOC made clear that if an employer requires employees to provide proof that they've received a vaccination from a pharmacy or their own healthcare provider, that the employer should warn the employee not to provide any medical information as part of the proof. And you're doing that again to avoid implicating the ADA, to avoid getting into a scenario where an employee can say, you made a disability-related inquiry, or you somehow you received information from me related to my medical condition that you shouldn't have received. Another question that the EEOC covered is, if an employer requires vaccinations when they become available on a more widespread basis, how should it respond to an employee who says, I can't take that vaccine because I have a disability? Well, the ADA allows employers to have qualification standards. These are the things that it takes to be qualified to have a job here. And those qualification standards can include a requirement that you be vaccinated. So if an employer has a mandatory vaccine policy, it requires all of its employees to be vaccinated, that's a qualification standard. Now the question is, what happens if that tends to screen out people who may have a disability? Well, the employer has to show that an unvaccinated employee would pose a direct threat, that's the standard we talked about before, due to a significant risk of substantial harm to the health or safety of the individual or others that cannot be eliminated or reduced by reasonable accommodation. It's an individualized assessment that the employer has to conduct when you come across an employee who says, I can't take the vaccine because of a health consideration, because of a disability. And the individualized assessment, according to the EEOC, has to take into account several factors, 4 factors. 1, the employer has to think about the duration of the risk, the nature and severity of the potential harm, the likelihood that the potential harm will occur, and the imminence of the potential harm. And you can imagine that those factors will be different depending on the industry, depending on the point in time. What may be, the nature and severity of the potential harm today may be very different a few months later or more months than that, when most of the population may be vaccinated. So a conclusion that there is a direct threat, so you go through those 4 factors and you conclude, yes, in fact, there is a direct threat, would include, the EEOC says, a determination that the unvaccinated individual will expose others to the virus at the work site. So things to think about, is this a service industry? Will the employee have contact with customers, for example, where they could in fact expose others to the virus? How many of my other employees are vaccinated? Are all of my other employees vaccinated? And does this person not have any contact with anyone outside the workforce when they come to work? Well, they may not pose a direct threat in that circumstance, even if they are unvaccinated. So it sort of depends is the answer. It's an individualized assessment that the employer would conduct when they have an employee who raises their hand and says, I can't be vaccinated because I have a disability. And if an employer determines that there is an individual who cannot be vaccinated due to a disability, and that person poses a direct threat at the work site, the employer is allowed to exclude that person from the work site, to say you can't come in. And they can do that unless there is another reasonable accommodation that they could provide. So the question is, one, do they pose a direct threat? I'm going to go through these 4 factors. And then, is there another reasonable accommodation that I could put into place that would enable this person to come to work? If the answer to that is no, they can be excluded. Now, when we talk about a reasonable accommodation up to the point of undue hardship, which is the standard under the ADA, that would eliminate or reduce the risk of the direct threat, we think about the same kinds of things that we've been talking about all these months, which are social distancing, wearing a mask. Can the person be separated in terms of the location where they're performing their work? Maybe they're in an office that's separated from other employees. So an employer needs to think about, other means of reducing or eliminating the risk of this direct threat of transmission, that they will expose others to COVID-19, even if they are not vaccinated. So it's a multi-step analysis. And then even if the employer finds that they pose a direct threat and there is no reasonable accommodation that would enable the employee to come into work, all we're saying at that point is you can exclude the person from the work site, not terminate the employee. So this whole analysis that we've been talking about is, can that person come into work? It doesn't mean you can automatically terminate the employee at that point. For an employee to be terminated under these circumstances, you'd have to, again, perform this reasonable accommodation analysis and see, for example, can the person work remotely? So many employees have effectively worked remotely over all of these months that in some sense it's become easier for employees to meet that test, that standard, to show that I could still contribute, I could still perform, in many cases, the essential functions of my job, even though I'm not at work. The EEOC acknowledges that this whole process that we're talking about, whether someone has a disability that would preclude vaccination, may include documentation. An employer may have to go to the employee and get some additional information about the reason why the employee believes they can't be vaccinated. Remember, though, we don't want to get disability-related information to the point, we don't want to make disability inquiries that are prohibited by the EEOC, by the ADA, unless you meet the threshold that I've articulated earlier. But there are ways to get the information from a healthcare provider, for example, that doesn't implicate what exactly the condition of the employee is. You can get, though, confirmation from a healthcare provider. Another question that was posed to the EEOC that it answered in this guidance is, how do you respond to an employee who indicates that they're unable to receive a vaccination because they have a religious belief or practice that they feel precludes them from participating in the vaccines? It's just like disabilities under the ADA, sincerely held religious beliefs are covered under Title VII, and there's a similar reasonable accommodation standard as you find with a disability. And once an employer, the EEOC says, is on notice that an employee's sincerely held religious belief, practice, or observance prevents the employee from receiving the vaccine, the employer has to consider a reasonable accommodation for the religious belief, practice, or observance, unless it would pose undue hardship under Title VII. The standard as between undue hardship and undue burden between Title VII and the ADA is a little bit different. Courts have defined undue hardship for these purposes under Title VII as having more than a de minimis cost or burden on the employer. So, if there is more than a de minimis cost or burden, the employer is not necessarily required to provide the accommodation. So you can imagine, and this is where I think SixFifty will come in, some automation and documentation coming into play here, where the employer has a form for employees where it says, I've been vaccinated and here's my proof of vaccination without extraneous medical information, or I have not been vaccinated because, A, I have a disability without asking for more medical information about that at that juncture. B, I have a sincerely held religious belief, and you can drill down on that a little as an employer if there's a reasonable good faith basis for doing that. or C, for another reason, and you can ask for more explanation on that other reason. And as Dr. Daines indicated, we're not sure whether pregnant women, for example, can participate in the vaccine. There will be anti-vaxxers and others who don't have a disability. It's not because of a sincerely held religious belief, but who don't want to take the vaccine for one reason or another. And with regard to those other groups, so we're not in a situation where we have to go through the analysis I talked about for a disability. Perhaps they don't have a sincerely held religious belief, but you have people that just don't want to take the vaccine, question the science, don't believe in it, feel it was rushed, whatever the answer is, anti-vaxxer. Those people can actually be terminated from their employment if the employer has a vaccine requirement and that they're not willing to satisfy that qualification standard. I will note, for example, if you have a group like of pregnant women, for example, who are reluctant to be vaccinated during the course of their pregnancy, the one issue to look out for there, you might say, well, I'm not terminating a pregnant woman because she's pregnant. I'm terminating her because she's refusing to take the vaccine and it's mandated for my workforce. The legal issue there to watch out for is disparate impact. Your on its face, neutral, objective requirement of vaccines may have a disparate impact, for example, on women or on pregnant women because they are not taking the vaccine. So with that, I know that we don't have very much time left, just about 7 minutes. I'll give it back to Kimball so that we can take some of your questions.
This has been great. Thank you, Marina. So just to reiterate, sounds like employers can prevent their employees from coming into the office if they have not been vaccinated. They can, in a lot of cases require it. There are some exceptions, but a vaccine can be required. Okay, so we have a lot of really good questions. We're going to try to get as many of these out as possible in the next 6 minutes until the top of the hour. This one is for Dr. Daines. Why does the Pfizer and the Moderna vaccines, why do they have 2 doses? And I think you kind of touched on that, but could you reiterate that again? Is that common for vaccines to have 2 doses? And kind of why do these ones have 2 doses?
So it is common for many vaccines to have 2 doses. If you think especially related to pediatric things we got as children, measles, mumps, rubella, those are ones where it's frequent for us to have a series of doses. Flu is a little bit different. Some of the adult vaccines are a little bit different. And really what I would say related to this question is you have to know how science is done. You set your hypothesis ahead of time and you go about proving or disproving it, and then you have to draw very narrow conclusions based on the information you get back. So, going back to this slide, the way that this experiment was set up was to give 2 doses, and this is the effect you see. Even though this is an interesting signal, you can't just on the basis of this prove that 1 dose is enough. Based on how this study was done, we can't say, for example, that after this moment, had the 2nd dose not been given, maybe that curve would go up like that. We just don't know. Think of it a little bit like a chocolate chip cookie recipe. You know what goes into it. You could make a hypothesis that if you cut the brown sugar in half, that this is what it would taste like, or if you doubled the salt, this is what it would taste like. But to actually draw that conclusion and say, I know what it tastes like, you have to bake it with that new recipe. And so there will have to be a study where it is done on, say, a 1-dose basis and see what happens before you could definitively say it works or it doesn't work. So we have to be careful of not extrapolating. We take interest in this moment, but we can't make a conclusion on it because the experiment wasn't set up to prove that.
Great, thank you, Will. That was, I think that was the first chocolate chip cookie analogy ever in the history of a 650 webinar, and definitely.
Oh, I'm all about cookie analogies. I got loads of them.
So thank you for that. Okay, Marina, this one's for you. This is from our friend Scott Bell at Dino Nobel. Did the EEOC make a distinction between requiring vaccines that have been approved on an emergency basis, like the current vaccines, versus a standard approval? or is there a difference between how the EEOC is going to treat those two types of approvals, or not?
So the very first question that the EEOC answered in the vaccine part of this guidance was drafted this way: for any COVID-19 vaccine that has been approved or authorized by the FDA, is the administration of the vaccine a medical examination? No. So it treated the vaccine the same way in the context of all of the Q&A it provided, whether it's the emergency use authorization or approval by the FDA. So for these purposes, for the guidance that the EEOC has provided and everything that I've talked about, it's not making a distinction between authorization and approval.
Great. Okay. We have another question for you, Dr. Daines. One of your slides shows, this is from one of our attendees, shows Pfizer and the Oxford AstraZeneca being both in phase 2/3. And if they are in the same phase as Pfizer, why hasn't Oxford AstraZeneca sought FDA approval? Or maybe they have.
So a couple of answers here. It's a really great question. Number one, the phase 2, phase 3, and then how something moves into authorization or approval, that varies a lot depending country by country, what their particular FDA-like organ, how they handle it. So that graphic of where something is on the timeline, it's really a smushing together of lots of different international standards. Specifically, the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine made news over the summer for 1 or 2 adverse events that may or may not have been related to the vaccine. Oxford AstraZeneca has also, by virtue of it being an adenovirus vector, has been combining efforts with some other adenovirus vectors. There were some things about dosage in the study that it appears require further investigation. So it's more of a work in progress to the point where I don't think they really felt comfortable putting together a fully formed FDA EUA request.
Okay, perfect. Thank you for that. Okay, we have one for Marina. Let's just take a last couple two here. If your employees can work 85% at 85% efficiency at home, from home, what metrics would you look at when making your decision to shift back full-time to the office?
I mean, it's an individualized assessment, right? And a lot of it, in a lot of jurisdictions and areas, you're still under these shelter-in-place orders, and you're prohibited in the Bay Area and California and a lot of other locations. There are extreme restrictions unless you're an essential business, and you're not allowed to bring employees back yet. Certainly that will gradually shift as the vaccine becomes more widespread and employers will have more options. Do we want to keep our employees working remotely or provide more flexibility? As many of our clients are providing more flexibility for the long term. And I'm sure you've seen that too with a lot of big technology companies saying permanently or for the next decade, you can work wherever you want to work. On the other hand, there are many employers who will say, we don't want to do that. As soon as people can come back, even though it's effective and they can be productive at home, there's a lot of benefit to bringing people together in the workplace that you can't achieve through remote work. Great.
So that is all the time we have today. Apologies for any questions we didn't get to. Thank you so much. I just want to say we are going to work with Marina and her team here at SixFifty to create a COVID, like a vaccine policy for you that takes into account all the complexities that Marina described, and that you'll be able to kind of customize to your specific circumstances. So look out for that. Again, thank you so much, Marina and Dr. Daines. What an informative, excellent webinar. So thank you very much. For those who would like this webinar, we are going to have it via video as well. And so we will notify you about that, and have a very happy holidays. Thank you very much.